it over to you all.
Got it. Thank you so much, Wendy. We are so excited to join you all today to talk about teaching elections and the Constitution with political cartoons from the National Archives. So if you could all just give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen right now. Excellent. We'll go ahead and dive right in because we've got a lot of great discussion and cartoons to share with you all today. But I'm going to take a moment and just let my colleagues say a brief hello. Again, I'm Kathleen. I'm based in Washington, D.C. And then Charlie, if you want to share where you are.
Yeah, I work at the National Archives building that some of you visited last summer on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Although since COVID, we've had a lot of liberal telework. So I mostly work from my home in Annapolis, Maryland, which is where I'm speaking to you from today.
And then Mark?
And I'm at the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. I'm the education director there, and I've been here 25 years at the Truman Library. So glad to be here this afternoon. And I have another Kentuckian that I might mention in my presentation also.
You do.
Sounds great. Thanks, Mark. And we're excited to bring you this program as a part of our National Civic Education Initiative, Civics for All of Us. While many people think of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., we have 40 facilities across the country, including the presidential libraries, where we preserve and protect the historically valuable records of the United States government. This makes for billions of primary sources. And so we like to do programs like these for educators where we can help connect you to specific primary sources that are going to fit your classroom needs, as well as some teaching strategies from our online resources. So we're excited to dive in today, and today's program will be interactive. We want to hear from you all as we explore some of the cartoons we've selected. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlie now to give us a brief introduction.
Great. Thanks, Katie. You know, we love teaching with political cartoons because we think they're great primary sources. They're visual primary sources, and coaching kids to take them apart helps students develop critical thinking skills. And we have a lot of cartoons. And so I'll tell you more about the number that we have and how we have them in a little while. But first, let's get started with breaking the ice with talking about a political cartoon. So I want you to use the chat box, and I want you to look at the cartoon that's on the screen right now. And I want you just to tell me what you see. Fishing, which I like fishing. You like fishing, probably. It's a fun activity. What do we see happening? An elephant and a donkey fishing. That's even better. Yeah. They're fishing. Two political sides fishing. Yep. Sitting on a log, fishing in the same pool from opposing sides. Very good. Fishing on the opposite sides. What pool are they fishing in? Okay. And so, you know, you're already noticing details about the cartoon, and you're moving down the road towards drawing some conclusions from it about our topic today, which is teaching about cartoons, elections, and the Constitution. So in an ideal world, this is my ideal world dimension. If you used a cartoon like this in your classroom, what kind of discoveries would you want students to make about elections and the Constitution? So the role that elections play in the Constitution, or maybe something just about elections themselves. But on that ideal plane, what could kids get from this cartoon? Good. Yep. I love that, how the political parties are trying to catch the voters. They're angling for votes, two sides of the pool. Okay, they could understand political parties. All those good things in the ideal world. Now, here's the hard part. We don't live in the ideal world, and you don't teach in the ideal world. You run into a range of responses to primary sources that you put in your classroom. So let me ask you now, in your real world frame of reference. What do you think would be some of the problems that your students would encounter if they were approaching a primary source like this, a visual primary source? And symbolism is maybe an ideal and a practical, depending on how we look at it. What are some practical challenges? Yeah, they'd be very literal in looking at the image. They would. They're not great with recognizing icons, for example. Okay, what else? Inferencing, excellent. Yes, yes. Not being able to recognize the underlying issues, excellent. These are all things that I recognize as being valid observations because I've had these problems with kids looking at cartoons like this, and I know you have too. So I want to move from that practical level of, okay, they're great in the ideal, but kids have a hard time with them. How can we help you with cartoons? So the next slide will show us a tool. And this tool is the document analysis worksheet. And there's a handout that accompanies this webinar. And Katie, do you want to just say a couple words about where that is for anybody who hasn't opened it yet?
Yeah, we've sent it to Wendy. So Wendy, have you been able to send it out?
That will be in our shared drive. So everyone has
Perfect.
access to that in the shared
Excellent.
drive.
Okay,
Excellent. So don't worry about jotting down links or anything. You're going to get
Yeah.
links to everything compiled in one place.
but when you go to the address on this slide, you will find that you are on the National Archives Education Resources page, and you will find that we have a lot of document analysis worksheets for different kinds of primary sources. And as you see on the screen right now, they're aimed at two different levels of learners. On the right, you see the type of resource that might be helpful for beginning learners, or maybe younger students, or maybe children who are just learning English. On the left, you see a document analysis worksheet for cartoons that would be appropriate for more advanced students or older students. And so you go in and you might use those with your students as you feel is appropriate. But either way, when you look at them, you're going to see a very helpful pattern, because when kids look at a visual primary source like a cartoon, they don't know where to begin. And so a worksheet like this can help them in about three ways. One, it gives them a starting point. So you put this in front of them and you say, okay, let's meet the cartoon first. We're going to ask some simple questions. And after they've asked simple questions, and this is like the web's depth of knowledge, in the sense that you start with level one, really factual questions, and you're going to observe the parts, and you notice that it asks you for words and visuals, and I'm looking at the left-hand example here. Okay, after you've kind of inventoried the elements of the cartoon, then you try to interpret it or make sense of it. And you'll see that they ask you helpful questions like which words or phrases are the most significant, or visuals, which of the visuals are symbols. And then after you've done those more interpretive level questions, then you could move on to the most open-ended part of this analysis sheet, which is using that cartoon as historical evidence. Now, I strongly recommend that you use a device like this because it's organized and it tells the kids where to start. But secondly, if you use this regularly, the kids can develop a mental toolbox. It becomes part of how they approach primary sources, so that when they see an unfamiliar primary source, they have internalized a set of questions or a technique that they can use to address sources like cartoons. And again, we have a range of other analysis worksheets for other kinds of primary sources. But thirdly, it gives you a great tool for formative assessment, because you can have the students use this and you can say, okay, everybody answer the first two sets of questions and stop there. And you can go around and see how they're doing. And if kids are having trouble with just observing the parts, which I've had a lot of students who need coaching with that, you can help those kids. Then you go on to the interpretive part, making sense of it. And again, you could have the kids just do that part and you could coach the ones who need coaching. So it's a good organizing tool and it's a good formative assessment tool. So I recommend that you go in and shop around and use these as your kids are using primary sources like the cartoons. Katie, next slide, please. So we're going to do two things as we advance through this. We're going to look at resources and we're going to look at cartoons. And this just gives you a sense that we have ebooks, and we have our wonderful resource Stocks Teach, and the Harry Truman has resources too. And we'll get all to those in due time, but let's get to some cartoons. Let's go to the next one. You know, we're going to talk about two big topics today. The first is cartoons and elections, but secondly, we're going to broaden out the focus a little bit and talk about cartoons and the Constitution. So first, we'll talk about elections. And as you know, it's important in civics for kids to understand that elections are critical. They are the engines of civic life. And on the next slide, we say a bit more about that. We say that by participating in elections, everyday Americans make the idea of popular sovereignty real. And over time, voters shape and reshape the government. So what we want the students today to learn how to do is become the informed and active voters of tomorrow. So part of that is like getting them to understand the role of elections. And part of that is to get them to understand the nature of elections, because in the flow of an election, when it's happening, you can get kind of swept away by the rhetoric. And we want students to be able to back up and see them as perennial parts of the American political system. So on the next slide, we can begin thinking about that a little bit, because we have a picture on the left that's about 125 years old, and you see the donkey and the elephant are just going at it. And you see the two candidates, Alton Parker and Teddy Roosevelt, in this case, standing back, looking at them. That's how we are watching news coverage of elections. It seems like a brawl, but studying political cartoons is a great way to get kids to be more informed as they observe elections and maybe inspire them to participate in elections. And we think that studying old political cartoons can strengthen their academic achievement by building their critical analysis skills and helping getting them more engaged in civic life. We think that old political cartoons can educate students about elections and their role in civic life today. And further, we purposely think that studying older political cartoons is stronger, because if you're studying them from a distance, you can talk about partisanship and how partisanship is shown without getting swept up in the divisive contemporary issues of today. I've been told by many teachers that it's really hard to even have classroom discussions today because the kids are so amped up about, politically polemic issues. So if you're looking at cartoons from 100 years ago, you can kind of distance yourself from today's big issues and talk about things like how the parties present themselves in elections. Next slide, please. So we have here three people, and we're going to talk about how cartoons portray people. And our first level is by talking about depictions of real people. So what do you see here? What's in this cartoon? How do these people look? What's their emotional state? They look happy. Happy, fake smiles. Love it. And so those are the happy and evil. Oh, I'd like to hear more about that, that emoji. Okay, now we go to the next slide. Same people. How do they look here? What do you see in this cartoon? Concerned, worried, nervous, pensive. Very good word. And this cartoon was from 1912, and it was published the day before the election, a famous election of 1912, when you had a very close race between three candidates for the presidency. On the next slide, we'll see the whole cartoon. Okay, and so what we have here is an artistic device where what we're going to do is we're going to contrast how they're acting up top and how they feel at the bottom. And so the question I guess I would get you to think about is, how would you bring this into the classroom, and how would you look at it? And my advice would be, one of the things you can do with these cartoons is think about ways to chunk them or divide them. So in this instance, what I did was divide the top and the bottom. And by having you look at those separately, I can get you to think about how the cartoonist is going to be getting you to draw a comparison from the top half of the cartoon to the bottom half of the cartoon. So in this cartoon, we're making that contrast by using real people, and we're geographically separating them with the words in the middle. I want to show you another example in which we're going to contrast real people with an iconic representation. But again, it's going to be chunking that's going to give us the answer to take it apart. Now we have that famous Kentuckian in this one. And I don't know if you've ever been to Lake Barkley, but there is Mr. Barkley himself, Alvin Barkley, in this cartoon from 1946. And he's sitting with another then Colossus of Congress, Sam Rayburn. And they're talking about reorganizing Congress. And they're saying, we think you'll like this reorganization of Congress. And as you see, those two political titans are holding their design for a new and improved Congress. Well, we're going to go to the other half of the cartoon and see another person. This one's not a real person. So in this cartoon, we're not contrasting real people in two different states of mind, but we're contrasting real people against an iconic representation. This guy's named John Q. Public, which in the 1940s was a common way to depict the American people. John Q. Public. And he says, well, you ought to see the reorganization plan we're working on for next November. Okay, and let's put it all together and talk about it. And so here we are, and we're going to learn something about elections on the next slide, because when we put John Q. Public together with those titans, we end up with this cartoon. We think you'll like this reorganization of Congress. Yes, but you ought to see the reorganization plan we're working on for next November. Can anybody tell me quickly how that cartoon works? How do the people and the iconic representation work together? What does it say about elections? And I'll remind you, there's an old adage that you get the Congress you vote for. And so Congress might think they're going to design how they're going to set up committees, how they're going to work together. But ultimately, it's the public that decides who's in Congress to begin with. So for your students, I think the question is, why should they vote? And young people often don't vote in congressional elections, because you, the public, shape through your participation in elections how this body works. And as Bobby points out, you work for us. People are the ones who ultimately are the designers. That's exactly right. So even old cartoons like this can get your kids to think about how the public shapes politics and how it shapes constitutional life. Mark's got a couple of great cartoons from the Harry Truman Library that are about elections and the Constitution. Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. And as we advance there, you notice that last cartoon was from 1946, which is actually during the Truman administration. So we have a segue there. And we'll come back to Senator Barkley in a moment. So when I do cartoons, the biggest problem I have is trying not to tell what I think about it, whether it's to teachers like you or to students that we have here at the Truman Library and Museum in Independence. It's hard for me to go mute and not try and tell everything about it. So I'm going to do my very best to do that right now by asking you a question, and you can type into the chat. And Charlie pointed out the document analysis sheets were a wonderful way of using those. We're going to take a slightly different approach here. Some of you who've worked with artwork and with museum exhibits and with posters, and art museums in particular use what we call visual thinking strategies. Very straightforward. You can look that up, or I can provide a link later. But the first question when you look at any image, whether it's a photograph, a poster, a cartoon, is what do you notice? So we're not talking any historical context here, no background information. We're going into this blind. And we do this a lot in our museum with students that come in maybe less informed than we like. So as you look at this cartoon, I'm going to show you two. This is the first one. What do you notice in this cartoon? And we'll see the number of answers we get that we can respond, that I'll respond to. So what do you notice? Very straightforward. It could be very simple. They're in the desert. A cow skull, cactus, pitchfork. These are going to scroll so fast. I might have to open up the box here a bit larger for me. They're in the desert, cow skull, cactus, passion from the left. One side is showing love, the other side is saying bad. Two men, concerned, two trains. The one is sweating, opposite thoughts. They're in the desert, trains side by side, two different trains. The caboose, because it's the back of the train, two trains. See if I can get back. That was my technological test for the day. Go full screen and then come back again while talking. The men are bigger than the train. I like that. See how we often think about cartoonists and the way they exaggerate features, in this case, exaggerating the two men. So here's the follow-up of all those things we've said. Can you come up with new things, other things that you notice that somebody hasn't said yet? And you guys have said a lot, but other things that nobody's said yet. Dark smoke. Excellent. The men are pounding on the rails. Different neckties. Sweat on the brow. This is awesome. Sign on the left looks like a pitchfork. One is calmer. They're looking in different directions. Both signs say special. I love it. These are great answers, actually. These are really good. So one thing you can do here, you can keep going with that. What else do you notice? If it's something that's, hang on, let me get more answers. Are they coming or going? One is pointing, the other has kind of a whatever hand, kind of like that, right? You can keep going with this as, you know, exhaust your students' answers. What else do they notice? If they say something that's maybe open to interpretation, you can say, you can follow up with what makes you say that. So are they coming or going? Or, you know, the ties or the sweat on the brow, so they can point out a particular detail. I've used this cartoon probably 100 times. I probably never noticed until today that they have different ties on. So there you go. You guys find in detail that I might not have noticed. Okay, now, then you can switch a little bit into who do we know, who do we think these two people are? Any ideas to who these two enlarged figures on the back of these trains are? We have a date at the bottom, which might help. And then if you think about when I was introduced, which presidential library I am representing, there's two clues for you. So it's 1948, 75 years ago. We're talking about elections. Thank you for Truman. Thank you, Morgan. Anybody remember who Truman was running against? That famous photograph of him holding up a newspaper? Dewey. Thank you, Roger. The famous Dewey defeats Truman photograph that he holds up the day after the election. So this is part of the 1948 campaign. It's September, so it's a couple of months before the election, which is November 2nd. Now, let's go a little further in terms of election and the things that you've noticed. Truman is on the left as you look at the cartoon, and Dewey is on the right. What is the cartoonist? In this case, it's James Berryman. What is the cartoonist saying about the two political campaigns? We talked at some before about contrast. If I'd have divided this up like Charlie did before, showed you one at a time, how is he contrasting them? Truman is worried. Dewey appears calm. One is more for peace. These are great answers. Yeah, Dewey's more for peace, yeah. Bringing people together. Anything else? What are two extremes? Give them hell or brotherly love. Excellent. Always important to read those signs on the back of the train. Different hand gestures. Wind of change. These are excellent. Whereabouts are they? Where in the country are they? Out west. Excellent. West or southwest. And again, that's where you might say, what makes you say that? Is that follow-up question. So they might point out the cactus and things like that, the desert landscape. You guys are doing a great job. I really like your answers a lot. And so Charlie actually tracked down the newspaper this was published in, and which was accompanied by a newspaper column about both campaigns. They were both campaigning out west, as you mentioned. They both made addresses in the Salt Lake City area and also in Denver and other places in that vicinity of the country. And they really contrasted the types of campaign that they were running. Truman was very aggressive in his campaign, whereas Dewey was far more peaceful in his tenure. Not so much about wanting war that Marlena suggested, but more aggressive. The group that he actually attacked was actually not Thomas Dewey himself, but he actually attacked the 80th Congress. And the nickname he gave the 80th Congress was the Do Nothing Congress, because it was Republican controlled at that time. Truman, running as a Democrat, accused the 80th Congress of doing nothing. He actually brought them back in for a special session in August of 1948. And so we continued that message all the way up to November. Okay, any other comments or questions about that one before we move on to the second cartoon? You guys did a great job breaking that down, considering you were given no forewarning that you'd be talking about the 1948 election. We're celebrating that this year because it's the 75th anniversary. Truman, of course, wins that election. Very close election, but he does win it, surprisingly. I don't see any comments or questions. So let's, Kathleen, if we could go on to the next cartoon. There we go. So we'll do this one a little bit quicker. This is actually by Clifford Berryman. The first one was by James Berryman. Clifford is the father, James is the son. This is a little bit closer to the election. The first one was in September. This one is October the 19th, and the election is November 2nd, so it's coming right up. So what do you notice in this particular cartoon? This one's maybe a little bit simpler, has their names on their hats. What do you notice in this one? Don't be shy. Dewey looks proud to be predicted to win. I'm going to have to go large again, make sure I don't miss anything. The polls favor Dewey. Looks like they see a landslide coming. Dewey thinks he has it won. Dewey looks to be the winner. Truman looks worried and sad. Dewey feels victory. Truman looks concerned, worried, hands in his pockets. The press favors Dewey. Dewey is saying, why do we even have an election? Difference in body language. Dewey's confident. These are great. Keep them going if you want to. One thing to help with students, yes, we got the document analysis, and yes, we got this idea of what do you notice, just even without any context at all. One thing I sometimes do, a couple of different things really, is sometimes I will ask students to identify emotions. So on that last one where Truman's got sweat pouring from his brow, sometimes I even have them do speech bubbles. Now we have one in this cartoon. What's the use of going through the election? But if you added more, like even thoughts, what is Truman thinking? You could add a speech bubble. What is he thinking? You guys have been saying it, right? Paul Wallace, because Wallace is listed on there as having 0 votes. There's actually 4 candidates that year. We have Wallace, and we also have Strom Thurmond with the Dixiecrats. So it looks bad. Now, the caption, what's the use of going through with the election? One thing I also do is sometimes I present the cartoons without a caption and have students create their own caption, which I think is a fascinating way to maybe sometimes change a point of view about a cartoon. The interesting thing about this one, Charlie and I were talking about this last week. This cartoon was reproduced later in a book, in kind of a political cartoon book of the 1948 election. And when they put it in the book, the election was over. So they did this probably in 1949. It was certainly after the 48 election. They published this in the book. And instead of the caption, what's the use of going through with the election? In the book, because it was published post-election, and because Truman actually won the election, The caption they used in the book was "Little White Lies," because after the election, this looked ridiculous. All of these were wrong. All of these polls were wrong. So sometimes a caption can really change your perspective on what a cartoon's message might be, or you can change it that way, or even, change the captions, things like that. You'll also notice in this one, they haven't really exaggerated the features of the two. Clifford Berryman was a different kind of cartoonist than Jim. Jim tended to exaggerate his figures, have more emotion. You can certainly see kind of a smugness with Dewey and Truman looking kind of downcast. But the previous cartoon by his son, James, you see a lot more emotion in his. So any final comments or questions on those? I'll pass it back to Charlie and Katie if there's no more questions or comments.
Right. Katie, I'm excited to give the teachers a chance to look at some cartoons. Do you want to organize us for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're gonna break up into some breakout rooms with Wendy's help. So Wendy, how many breakout rooms would you recommend for today?
I've got 8 breakout rooms. So I was thinking if we've got the two different picture groups, like 1 through 4 could be group 1.
Perfect.
And then everybody 1 through 4 will be looking at the first photo, and then groups 5 through 8 will be looking at, if that's fine with you.
That works for me. So I'm going to just grab the links so I can drop those in the chat so everyone has the cartoon to take a look at. These are going to open in Docs Teach, which is our online tool for teaching with documents. You'll get the full cartoon. You'll also get some background information. So groups 1 through 4, I'm going to go ahead and just put both of them in the chat. There's cartoon 1. That's the Hepburn rate bill. And then the groups 5 through 8 are going to get cartoon 2.
And Katie, as you do that, let me just interrupt and say, now, folks, these two are going to back the camera up a little bit, and we're going to talk about the Constitution through cartoons. We talked specifically about elections coming up, so I didn't want you to be too surprised when you look at these and you go, where's the election? But these are more about what can you learn about the Constitution from cartoons.
Exactly. And so here is the other link, and we'll also be available to help get links to people if they need them. And then I'm just going to share a couple of questions too to kind of start with some of the same cartoon analysis techniques we've done today, or if you have some that are tried and true that you used with your students before, this would be a great time to kind of share with each other. And then just in terms of thinking about, okay, the Constitution and political cartoons, what big ideas can we pull from this cartoon? How do they show separation of powers or balance of powers? And what concepts might be difficult for students to see in real life? So with that, let's go ahead and do breakout rooms. And I think, let's see, if we could do about 8 minutes, I think that would be a great place to get started.
And I will broadcast your Doc Teach links in your breakout rooms as well for you.
Awesome.
So,
thank you.
welcome back, everyone.
Great. I'll share the PowerPoint presentation again, and then we can talk a little bit about what you all observed. Charlie, while I get this going, would you like to start the Hepburn rate? Start with the Hepburn rate bill?
Charlie, you're muted.
There we go. My students wish we had this feature back when I was in the classroom, I gotta tell you. So what about cartoon 1 through 4? Would groups like to share some of their observations about this one?
Feel free to put it in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute
Mhm.
and share. That's all good.
Yeah, I think if you unmute and share a couple of words, that's actually the most efficient way to do this. And so, you know, what big constitutional thing do you see going on here?
The bill
Our
has,
group,
Go ahead, sir.
our group decided that it looks like the bill's going back from the Senate to the House.
Yep.
But it's been amended so much, it's almost unrecognizable.
Excellent. Okay. And then the other person who was speaking at the same time, go ahead. Someone said our group, and then they were cut off.
that's what we said, that, you know,
Mhm.
that it had weakened the bill so much that it was not even what the bill was probably originally for.
Good. Do the other two groups have observations? You know, you look at poor Bill, and this is the process that the founders gave us, and it's very hard for a guy like Bill to make it through Congress unscathed. And he was an optimistic and happy piece of legislation who was going to change the world until he got to the Senate. And now he's coming back to the House again. Do you think your students would find this cartoon difficult or inviting? Do you think they'd like studying about the legislative process with this cartoon? Oh, what does the teddy bear represent? Well, Clifford Berryman drew the teddy bear after Roosevelt went on this famous hunting trip, and it became popular. So he just kept using them. You have to ask the question every time you see the little teddy bear, what do you think it represents? Does it just is it just a little wise guy observation? You know, just an ironic observation. Looks good to me. Well, Bill doesn't look too good to me. But you'll see the teddy bear in many of Clifford Berryman's cartoons. Because our time is limited today, let's take these as a starting point for this cartoon and go on to the second one. So in groups 4 through 8, we had a wonderful conversation about this in group 5. Damien, you want to say a couple of words about this?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is a great cartoon. So just to start on a surface level, there is a man with the name Congress on his hat saying, "Lend me the FBI." A man with Truman on his hat saying, "No, and stay on your side of the fence," with a separation of powers separating the legislative side of the grass from the executive side of the grass. And from there, we discussed some misunderstandings kids may have, because kids know that the legislative branch passes bills. Students know that the executive branch enforces laws, but they don't always know that there is debates behind the scenes about the separation of powers, about the different branches butting heads. So we thought this would be a wonderful cartoon to communicate the sort of friction that sometimes happens within our government.
Excellent. Thank you, Damien. Anybody like to add to that? You know, one of the points that was made in group 5 is that we think about the FBI as generally federal. We don't really associate it with the executive branch. And this is a way to coach kids to look more closely at the government and how you have, you know, the executive branch, the legislative branch, but under the executive branch, you do have the many agencies of today, and to ask about the role of Congress in those agencies, because that's important in our times, as it is always, to think about that. Okay, Katie, I'm going to hand it back to you, and perhaps we could move on to talking about some great resources that teachers would like to take into the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I just saw a question from the last cartoon from Roger, and I was just reading about this earlier. But yes, since this particular cartoon is from 1906. Roosevelt was president and in favor of this legislation, which had to do with like railroad regulations. While there were a lot of amendments to it, the main tenets of the bill were there. So that kind of looks good to me. from the teddy bear. In this case, does kind of connect back to Roosevelt, the person, but we do see the teddy bear in use beyond Roosevelt's administration. And as Charlie mentioned, definitely becomes kind of a comedic aside in many of these cartoons. But that's always a fun detail for students to notice. And with that, we'll go into additional resources. So we have so many cartoons at the archive, so many online resources, they don't all fit into an hour. So we've tried to compile some of our favorite resources for you to take and use and share. So I'm going to have Charlie share a little bit more about some of the Center for Legislative Archives resources, and then I'm going to share what you can find on Docs Teach.
Yeah, and I'll just reassure you that the things we talk about are on the handout. So although we're going to go fast, you have all this stuff listed. Again, we have about 2,500 of the Berryman cartoons at the Center for Legislative Archives. So we've used them a lot in various resources. On the next slide, we have an array of them. You can see that we have ebooks and we have lessons. And so here are the 3 of the ebooks. Representing Congress. These are all free ebooks. They're PDFs and they're available at the address you see at the bottom of the screen. On the left, Representing Congress is about Congress and the Constitution. So like the Hepburn Rate Bill Act and the Separation of Powers Act would both be in that ebook. America and the World and A Visual History are 2 books we created because teachers told us that teaching foreign policy was very difficult. And so we made 2 books that cover American foreign policy through Berryman cartoons. The first covers 1898 to 1940, and the second 1940 to 1963. So we hope that you go in and look around because there's a lot of individual cartoons within either of those books, or any one of the 3 of them, that you might find useful for your students. But we also have lessons. And so if we go to the next slide, this is just one example of a lesson. In this one, it's studying US elections with political cartoons. And you notice on the little example to the right, 2 of the cartoons we talked about today are in there. This is a lesson that has the students work in stations because we feel that hands-on work with primary sources is critically important. So we organized this lesson to have the students basically parallel what we talked about at the beginning of this webinar by working through stations and answering reflection questions about the constitutional role of elections and how you can get at that through studying political cartoons. But we have other lessons. On the next slide, I'll show you just a list of them because there are other topics you can study with political cartoons. We made a lesson on studying the Constitution. We made a scavenger hunt with political cartoons where cartoons represent different principles and then you study the text of the Constitution to find them. We have one that's more focused on Congress and different features of Congress, how the House is different from the Senate, etc. And that lesson you see in number 2. More generally, at the end of the year, when you want to review big civics ideas for an assessment, we put another one of those lessons where they work at workshops to review big civics ideas through political cartoons. And then as a big review for US history, we made a lesson that has the students work in, again, carouseling through different workshop stations to review major topics in US history from 1940 to 1963. And again, the URL for each of these lessons is on your handout. So if one of those seems interesting, go ahead in and take a look at it and see if it would fit in your class. Katie, what's next? I think it's Docs Teach.
I think so. And also I'll mention too on the handout is linked from the Truman Library, a great lesson that pulls cartoons related to that 1948 election if you want to go even do a deep dive into that election and how it's represented in cartoons. That's linked on the handout as well. Additionally, if you just want to browse and see what's there, a great place to get started is docsteach.org, which is our online tool for teaching with documents. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got billions of records at the National Archives. Now, the way we get political cartoons is interesting, right? Because they aren't government records. You're going to find a lot of political cartoons in other repositories, but we do have this great collection because of this Berryman collection that was donated to the Senate. Charlie, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, you're right.
Enters the care of the Center for Legislative Archives. Also, various presidential administrations are gifted cartoons or acquire them through the course of business. So it makes for a really interesting collection. So to get started, you can just do a search on Docs Teach for political cartoon, and you'll find some of the ones our educators have found to be useful, that align to different big ideas, big topics, historical events. You can also, if you want to do a deeper dive, recommend checking out the website for the presidential administration you might be searching for cartoons for. And then, of course, if you really want to dive in, the National Archives online catalog has even more digitized records available. But if you want to find something quick, searching for political cartoons or political cartoon in the topic or time period you're looking for, DocsTeach is a great place to get started. We also have online activities on DocsTeach. So we have different activity templates that you can use to share with your students, either assign to them to complete on their own or broadcast to the class and have them discuss or notice different things. In fact, our document analysis worksheets even have an online version that can be completed online. But I wanted to spotlight this activity because it ties into nicely the themes we've been talking about and actually uses one of the cartoons we mentioned earlier, but through a slightly different lens. So in this activity, you get a teacher page that gives you everything you need to know to facilitate the activity. Clicking on Start Activity actually takes you to the student page. This is the link you'd share with your students that has really specific instructions and questions. And in this cartoon, students are comparing the different constitutional processes for assuming office by looking at these cartoons. So we see the one related to John Q. Public and Congress, the Electoral College, and the votes being tallied on the bulletins. And then we've got this one that references Supreme Court nominations. So students can analyze these and look at the corresponding text in the Constitution to make those connections of kind of like what the way these ways of assuming office actually look like in real life. So that's a resource to check out. We've got some other online cartoon resources on DocsTeach that are more geared towards actually picking up the symbolism and different artistic techniques in cartoons too. And those are linked on the worksheet as well. And then finally, we have another worksheet that's useful for analyzing perspective in primary sources, especially when we think about Clifford Berryman and Jim Berryman. They depict a lot of civic life. But we also can think critically about what they're depicting. How are they representing John Q. Public? What stories are missing from their depictions of civic life? And this Analyzing Perspectives worksheet can be a useful tool for getting your students to think about, okay, what part of the story isn't in this document? And this can be used with documents like political cartoons, written documents, photographs, and it kind of follows those same steps that we use on our other individual document analysis worksheets. And it also gets students to think about too, like what do they bring to looking at this cartoon? And then finally, I just want to mention this program is part of our Civics for All of Us program. We've got online distance learning programs for students available by request with educators like Charlie and Mark and myself. We offer webinars periodically that are open for groups of all sizes to sign up. This is a great way, just as we saw today, where we take primary sources and use them to unpack some of these big civics ideas. We also, as Wendy mentioned, periodically offer workshops. Our next one is actually coming up on Thursday. This one will be about teaching Korematsu versus the United States. And we'll be posting some additional free online workshops happening in the following spring month soon. So we hope to see you at some of our future programs. And with that, I want to thank you all. Again, thank you, Charlie and Mark, for joining us for this presentation. And thank you for inviting us to share all of these resources with you today. We can pause here and see if you all have any questions or observations, anything we can help you with when it comes to accessing our resources. Please let us know. But thank you so much, Wendy, and everyone for this opportunity to connect with you today.
Thank you all very much. And I will say, we're going to drop everything that they have given us, the wonderful document with all of these resources, as well as contact information. If you would like to invite them into your classroom, which we do, as you can see today, what a wealth of information they have to share. Your students would love this. So we will put all of that in your shared drive for both the Hero as well as for the Charge group. So please, actually, Jamie is so wonderful. She's already probably got it in there as we speak. I know I emailed that out on the Sunday night email for our Charge leaders. I do think I forgot that for my Hero group, so I apologize. That's on my bad on that. Thank you all so much. If you all have any questions, we'll stay on for just a minute. I will drop a copy of our session evaluation in the chat, so make sure that you definitely complete that. It marks your attendance for today. So thank you all so much. Again, this was a wonderful session. I know this weekend, our Hero leaders, they're going to go to Kentucky Historical Society to learn a little bit more about visual thinking strategies. So that was a really great intro for that as well. So thank you all very much.
Great, thank you.